Welcome back to the Nick Hilaris Show. What are the 5 states that have the nonpartisan setup?
Yes. I'll give it to you in order of when they adopted it. It's Nebraska, Washington, Louisiana, California, and Alaska. Those are the 5 states. And they each
Okay.
have their own different nuances, but what's true among all of them is that as a candidate, you don't have to first run through your party's primary and then get to the general election. You campaign and build support from a majority of voters right from the very beginning. And that's a game changer. I mean, we talked to a state senator in Alaska who ran under this new system that under the old party primary, she would only knock on the doors of Republican voters through a list that the party provides. And if you win that primary, it's game over. It's a Republican district. You don't really have to go knock on any more doors. Under the new system, what she told us is, I knock on every door now because everyone can vote for me and everyone's vote and voice deserves to be heard. Think about the impact or the difference in a democracy between elected officials who are only knocking on the doors, which means they're only listening to a small segment of their voters, versus a democracy in which our elected officials are talking to everybody. Which do you think will provide, better outcomes, more representative outcomes?
Yeah.
It's quite clear.
Yep. It's pretty obvious. Yeah, I actually brought my California primary
Nice.
ballot. Yeah, with me. Which another thing I found actually talking to members of just friends and parent friends is that some people didn't even realize that California had gone to open primaries, which that
Yep.
says something. Says something as well. In these 5 states, is there a noticeable statistical increase in voter participation in these elections?
What we see is that states with nonpartisan primaries have about 6 percentage points higher turnout. And that's a function of voters being able to have more choice on their ballot and have a greater motivation to go and vote. But beyond turnout, which is the traditional measure of how we think about the health of a democracy, how many citizens are showing up to participate, I think that sometimes that can be distracting because you can have high participation in a very unrepresentative system. So what we look at is how many voters are turning out in elections that actually uh, are deciding the outcome, meaning elections that are competitive, have more than one person on the ballot, that aren't foregone conclusions based on party affiliation alone. And what we found, for example, is in Alaska, the number of voters casting meaningful votes, meaning in elections where their votes matter, went up close to 60% after that state adopted a nonpartisan primary system. So yes, you get higher turnout, but more importantly, you get more voters casting ballots where their candidate selection actually impacts who's elected.
That's fascinating. And if we rewind the clock, like the problem with the old system that was in place in sort of the early America is that these political bosses were incredibly corrupt and would only put forward, they basically controlled who got on the ballot.
Right.
And so the primary was adopted as an antidote to that by saying anyone can in the party can get on the ballot. Not anyone. I'm sure each state had different rules, but anyone could get on and we'll take a vote instead of Boss Tweed picking it. We'll take a vote. And what happened over time, it sounds like, is that with probably from a combination of sort of gerrymandering and modern technology, the primary process became sort of equally corrupt as the boss system in producing outcomes that aren't good for America. Um,
In
but it
short,
sounds
the
like,
way I
yeah,
describe it is that we replaced the party bosses with the party bases. We traded one set of elites for another. Um, the party leaders for the party activists. We never got to the place where we actually gave the power to a representative group of the electorate to decide these elections. And so I think the reformers who created the direct primary had the problem right, but the solution, at least in today's context, is the wrong one. And that's what we need to continue to build on the foundation they laid to evolve the system and to improve it. And
yeah,
I think that one of the most important arguments I make in the book is that it's not just good for the voters and good for the country to make this change. The political parties themselves ought to want this, because one of the reasons why they were on board with this direct primary in the first place was how much factionalism existed within the parties. And they thought opening it up to the voters would reduce that. Well, today there's a lot of factionalism and division within the political parties, because you have these small groups of activists deciding these elections. And the impact of that is that the parties are nominating candidates outside the mainstream of the general electorate. And so you see the Democrats, for example, nominating candidates to the left of the median voter and losing those seats. The Republicans are doing the same thing. They're going to be more competitive, more healthy as political parties, to the extent that their system of nominating candidates is more reflective of the electorate. And I think that's in their own competitive interest to adopt these reforms as well.
Yeah, especially in light of too what you mentioned earlier in this discussion about how there's this huge chunk of Americans who don't identify really with either party, and they're up for grabs, and so political
Exactly.
parties who are trying to be competitive need to find a way to reach them.
Yeah. Why
And
wouldn't
in,
you, right? If you just think about it, your party is an enterprise that is trying to maximize market share. Why would you lob off what is now the largest segment of that market and not be able to talk to those customers and market the ideas that you have? I mean, I think that the party that wakes up to this issue first is going to have a comparative advantage in our elections, because there's a whole lot of voters that are just entirely disillusioned because they're so disenfranchised today.
yeah, and I think the Trump 2016 win actually sort of proves this point about it being up for grabs, because a bunch of people who may have identified as Democrat even switched,
Mhm.
and obviously a bunch of independents did as well. And so yeah, it can make or break an election.
Right. We know this presidential election will come down to who independent voters support in a handful of states.
Yeah.
And it is absurd to me that in several of those states, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, those same independents have no ability to influence the candidates that either party is putting forward. It makes no sense.